Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to the channel. Today I thought we'd talk about Python and whether it's a good language to learn in 2020. When deciding whether to learn a programming language or not, there's a few things you should look at. I'm also going to go into whether it's a good idea to learn Python as your first programming language. So the biggest strength of Python and the reason it's so popular is that it's a really great language for prototyping. What that means is, if you have some sort of idea that you want to translate into code, it's usually a lot easier to do so using Python than any other programming language. There's an element of risk when you're building a large piece of software that something might go wrong and all the effort you put up to that point is going to be wasted. So to minimize this risk, what teams do is they'll put together a proof of concept, which is essentially a rough draft of this large project that you want to create. There's a few reasons why it's easier to translate ideas into code using Python than other languages. The main one being Python is a very lean programming language, and it's missing a lot of the features that more complex programming languages have. By default, Python variables and collections are all mutable. This means you could take a variable that has a value and reassign it to another value. You could also take an array and maybe take the third element and change it. Another huge reason Python is so easy to work with is that it's a dynamic programming language. What that means is that it doesn't have a type system. If you want to create a variable and make it equal to 2, you just write x equals 2. If you want to make it equal apple, you write x equals apple. You can't do that with a programming language like Java or Kotlin, which has a type system. And this kind of ties together with the previous point where everything is mutable. You can really move things around and shift things around fairly seamlessly without a ton of limitations. And Python also doesn't have any memory management or memory optimization related features. Features such as pointers or memory allocation that you typically find in C, C++, or Rust. So you could see how if you want to write some complex piece of software using Java or C++, it might make sense to actually prototype it first using Python. You're going to save a lot of time and you're going to see if your idea even makes sense. So prototyping and POCs aside, let's talk about some more general reasons to learn Python in 2020. So the first reason would have to be that the simplicity of the language makes it fantastic for beginners. The syntax is simple, it doesn't have all those complex features, and it's generally a pleasant language to work with. The second reason would have to be that it's very popular. If you want to be a web developer, it's a great option. It's commonly found in web stacks. It's also primarily used by data scientists and machine learning engineers, so even if you want to go in that direction with your career, Python is a great option. If you run into some problem, it's also very easy to find the solution. I use a programming language called Elixir at work, and when I run into a problem, it's pretty tough to find a solution on Google. This is not at all the case when I'm using Python. I think Python makes perfect sense for a current or aspiring web developer, machine learning engineer, or data scientist. In the web development world, there's a lot of jobs that require Python, and there's a lot of very mature frameworks for web development using Python. Django and Flask are very popular backend frameworks for web development, and tools like Spark are compatible with Python as well if you want to go into machine learning, data science, or just the big data world in general. Now, of course, every programming language has its drawbacks, and Python is no exception. Unfortunately, some forms of software development just don't have the option to use Python. For example, the type of work embedded software engineers do, which is designing low-level systems or drivers. Basically, software that runs in an environment with a very limited amount of resources, and therefore it has to optimize for memory and sometimes even power. Python is incredibly inefficient when compared to something like C, C++, or Rust, and therefore it's just not going to be a good option for that type of work. Also, in some types of software development, the programming language is decided for you. For example, Google decided that if you want to develop an Android application, you have to use Java or Kotlin. There's no other option. Similarly, for iOS, you need to use Swift, and for front-end applications, you need to use JavaScript. Aside from that though, it comes down to preference. There's always a trade-off when picking a programming language. If you pick Python, you're going to get a language that compiles almost instantly and is pretty easy to write and read, but you're going to give up a lot of safety that you get with a language like Java. For example, in Python, you're able to create a function that takes two numbers and then divides them by each other and then call that function and pass it two strings. The program will run and you'll only get an error when somebody actually hits that function, which is bad because that means your software is running and users are actually accessing it, and that's not when you want to know that something is wrong. With a language like Java, that's just not going to happen. It's not going to compile if it sees a rudimentary error like that. So it's important not to focus on the flaws of the language, but weighing the pros and cons and seeing which one makes sense for you. I think Python is one of the best programming languages to learn, especially for a beginner. It mostly consists of basic functionality that you're going to find in most other programming languages as well. This means you can learn Python, and even if you never use it, the next programming language you learn is going to be that much easier to learn. This two-step process will probably be even easier than if you tried to learn that more complicated programming language from the beginning. One other reason to learn Python is that it's really good for programming interviews. When you're solving a programming interview, the problem tends to be pretty complex. And essentially what you have is the problem and then your implementation, which is in a programming language. When you strip a lot of the complexity from the programming language out, you're left with a less difficult task overall. It depends on the type of work you want to do, but generally I think you should learn Python in 2020. We'll wrap it up here, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.